Just about 2 weeks ago, you were lined up for your first hearing for confirmation as CDC Director, but that didn't work out as planned.
I knew exactly what I was going into. I knew they were going to pick apart all my statements from the past, and Pharma was not pleased with my nomination.
There's no common ground to be found.
Oh, it's hyper-polarized. To some degree, the hearings are political theater, and it's a fight. You don't get donations and you don't get your volunteers by getting along. When you're sticking your neck out like I was, you're putting a little target on your forehead.
Since you don't know why exactly, I think there is something we do know. We know it was the heart of the controversy around you, and it goes back maybe even more than 20 years.
Why do we have all this autism going on? I asked the CDC officials the very question, why? And they had no explanation.
Why are they so afraid that Bobby or you would actually do the science?
Why are they intimidating? Why are they bullying? Why are they refusing to do the proper kind of studies?
It's that big.
Trillions of dollars.
It's trillions. It's trillions. If this comes out, the CDC's done. Does it stop at HHS? Does it wipe out all of HHS? Or does it kill the confidence of every American in our government? And does it wipe out the government of the United States of America?
Well, it could go beyond that.
Dr. David Weldon, I want to just thank you for joining us on the MAHA podcast to begin with.
Oh, it's great to be with you, Del.
Yeah.
Great to be on the podcast.
Yeah. Just about 2 weeks ago, you were lined up for your first hearing for confirmation as CDC Director, but that didn't work out as planned.
Yes, unfortunately. I took a phone call 12 hours before my hearing stating that the White House was withdrawing my nomination. They saw, quote unquote, no pathway for me to get through.
We were watching the hearings. We watched Robert Kennedy Jr. go through the hearings. Very tight. He's been very tight in the I guess it's the Finance Committee that's really making the decisions, but also Health Committee is having hearings. And at the center of those is Senator Cassidy.
Correct.
Who seems to be wielding a lot of power there because there's no Democrats crossing over, except for actually, I think Marty Mercury, I believe, got Dr. Mercury got 2 or 3 Democrats to cross over, but meaning it's razor tight. You're just one vote makes the decision whether you can get out of committee or not.
Correct. Now, Bobby had to go in front of both the Health Committee and the Finance Committee. I was just in front of the Health Committee. And Dr. Cassidy is the chairman of that committee.
Okay.
And they operate under an assumption that all the Democrats are going to vote no. Now, I thought I might have picked up a few Democrats. I had a really great meeting with the senator from Colorado, Hickenlooper, who said, I'm probably not going to vote for you, but he didn't say I'm not going to vote for you.
Right.
And then he proceeded to have a great conversation with me about how he improved services and cut spending as the mayor of Colorado, and then became governor of the state and did the same thing, cut spending and improved services. So he started talking like a Republican. And
right.
I guess he maybe has a little Republican streak in him. Who knows?
Interesting.
He might have voted for me.
And you have a background, we're going to get into it, as yourself having been in Congress for
14 years.
14 years. So this process wasn't lost on you. I mean, whereas I think for Robert Kennedy Jr., it's the first time he's ever even been near this political monster.
Yeah, I knew exactly what I was going into, and I knew they were going to pick apart all my statements from the past, and many people would try to use those against me. And I also knew that Pharma was not pleased with my nomination because of my previous work on vaccine safety issues.
Right. But you are a doctor.
I am a doctor. I've been a doctor for over 40 years, and I actually give vaccines, hundreds of them every year, and they call me anti-vax, which is kind of funny when you think about it. And I vaccinated my kids, but if you say anything questioning the safety, particularly of the childhood vaccine schedule, then you are labeled as being anti-vax, even though, as in my case, I give vaccines.
Right, which is incredible. I mean, that's you haven't just sort of put this line in the sand. You cross it on a daily basis, which is really what I want to get into the heart of this conversation is what line are you straddling? Why is there a line to straddle? Like many things. But before we go to those issues that I think were weighed upon, why is it? I want to just understand this process of confirming somebody because I haven't ever paid attention. I don't think. Honestly, most of America, I don't think, has paid that much attention to this process. Certainly not for HHS Secretary.
It's in the
CDC
Constitution.
Director.
It's in the Constitution. That's where it
Yeah.
got started. The founding fathers who wrote the Constitution reserved the right to the Senate, not the House. I served in the House. The House has no confirmation rights, the rights to confirm cabinet secretaries and other officials, including ambassadors. And the Senate covets that power and authority given to them in the Constitution. So they take it very seriously. I mean, the Senate has been doing very little other business for the last 3 months, 4 months, other than the confirmation process. So
Wow. Yeah.
once a new administration comes in, the Senate really goes to town on inspecting and picking apart the cabinet nominees in detail.
Why did the founding fathers not see that the president should just get his nominees? I mean, the entire nation voted for
That's a great
him.
question. What you have to do is go back and read Madison's notes to find the answer to that question. But James Madison, who later became president, took copious notes during the debate on the Constitution, which occurred years after the Revolution. And you could probably get an answer to that question, but I can't answer it.
You don't know why that is.
Yeah.
So then my question is, because I don't remember, like as I said, I think what's been interesting about this cycle, and one of the things I've said to reporters is, if I prior to Robert Kennedy Jr. going through the hearings, I would say to reporters, if I stop anyone on the street right now, 1,000 people in your average city in America, and I asked, who's the current HHS secretary, how many people would be able to tell me? And most reporters say maybe zero. I said, if I asked them who's about to be HHS secretary, then it's like, yeah, a lot would say Robert Kennedy Jr. Like there's this new attention. I think part of it's Trump's doing. I think Trump, whether you love him or hate him, has created engagement. Like people are involved. And then Bobby Kennedy brought enough conflict and interest and intrigue as an independent candidate and a Kennedy that suddenly everyone's paying attention to a process that we've never tuned into before.
Well, you can credit Donald Trump for a lot of that. I grew up in the New York City suburbs, and I remember when he was first getting his start in commercial real estate, he was on TV all the time. So this guy understands the value of television and celebrity. So even before The Apprentice, this guy was a well-known commodity in the New York City area. And he really does understand the power of media and the influence of television. Now, of course, the internet even more so.
Yeah.
And when you bring a Kennedy in, there's so much mystique to that name, the family name. It just creates an incredible dynamic. But generally speaking, yeah, you can ask a lot of people on the street, who's your congressman? They may not know. And your senator, they may not know. The governor. People can usually tell you who the president is. A lot of them can also tell you who the vice president is, and most of them can tell you who their governor is.
Yeah.
But once you get beyond that, but now today, everybody knows who Trump is, and everybody knows who Bobby Kennedy is.
Yeah. So when we look at that, then it's an interesting point. I mean, while you're there, I mean, do you think that is beyond whatever President Trump's concern is with the vaccine program, which he's sort of stated in health and children, how much do you think that bringing a Kennedy on was a part of his math around him? Because I hadn't really had anyone. It's an interesting point, right? If I have a Kennedy with me, that's going to create more media and attention. You feel like that plays in?
Well, possibly, though I have to say, to my knowledge, Trump and Bobby have known each other for many, many years. Yeah. And Bobby actually approached President Trump in 2016 about making me CDC director back then. And as I understand it, President Trump has a personal interest in this issue, that he feels that more research needs to be done on vaccine safety. And vaccine policies need to be scrutinized a little more carefully. And so I think it was more to it than that, though. I think, Bobby's emphasis on nutrition, his emphasis on additives in the food supply, I think President Trump really takes those issues to heart. And it's a crazy situation. If the Democrats had let Bobby into the primary process, he probably would have beaten Biden handily, and he might have been the nominee, and he could have potentially beat Trump. Ironically, I don't know about that.
I looked at polls. I was a part of the process. A lot of people know I was director of communications for some time for Bobby Kennedy on his campaign, and there were a lot of polls that showed that Bobby was the only one that could beat President Trump on the Democrat side.
I believe that's an accurate statement.
Yeah.
Bobby is the only one who could have. He may not have, but
could
he's
have.
The only one who
Everyone
could have.
could. Yeah.
And then to see the two of them join up, it's just it's amazing. And they say politics makes strange bedfellows.
It sure does.
But I had a conversation with Bobby like that 20 years ago. The way I got to know Bobby is I was working to try to get the toxic mercury preservative thimerosal out of the childhood vaccine schedule. And Bobby calls me up to help me with this. And we both were saying to each other on the phone, I can't believe I'm working with you. He's a Democrat and I'm a Republican. He's kind of liberal.
Yeah.
I'm kind of conservative, though, I'm liberal on some things and he's conservative on a lot of things. So we're really a lot more alike than you would think.
This conversation could go in a million directions. The truth is I believe most Americans are more aligned across party lines than they realize. I once had an experiment with the first person in my family that moved into the Republican space, and everyone hated him, and my cousin Norman. And I went to him one day. He was dropping through New York, and I said, "Hey," because we were all like very, ferociously political. We grew up arguing politics or whatever. And I said to him, I want to have a different conversation. I want to talk about how we see what's wrong in the world, but I just don't want, neither one of us gets to blame the party that did it. I just want to see, are we aligned on war, on Iraq? By the end of the day, I found that, like I said, Norm, do you realize we agree on probably 85% of what's wrong in the world and what's, going on, and we would do things exactly the same. The only thing we're disagreeing on is who's causing the problem.
Yeah, I think part of the problem actually with what you're getting at is if I'm getting along with you on a particular subject, that's not newsworthy. Right. But if I'm arguing with you on a given subject, people will watch that. And, it's like the old story, if the pastor retires after 50 years of serving his congregation and gets a gold watch, nobody is going to care about that much. Oh, gee, nice. But if the pastor after 50 years is found out to be embezzling from the church, after 50 years, everybody's going to tune into that,
Right.
So it's sort of the nature, it's human nature.
Yeah.
We're drawn to a controversy, we're drawn to a conflict. But when I was in Congress, I worked with a lot of Democrats on a lot of issues.
Yeah.
And a good example is vaccine safety issues.
Yeah.
Some of my strongest allies on that were Democrats, and I was a Republican. And the other thing is, my congressional district here, we call this area the Space Coast.
We're in Florida right now. Yeah. Just outside of Orlando.
and I had the Cape Canaveral, Air Station. It's now Space Force Station and Kennedy Space Center, and so I was always working space issues, and I was always reaching out to my Democratic colleagues and many of them would help me because they had, a NASA facility in their district, or maybe they had a university doing business with NASA. But that sort of stuff just doesn't cause people to tune into the news.
Right. We don't want to hear how you're getting along. And then the media feeds on it. It now more and more just feeds, as Bobby said, the culture war issues, the things that we'll argue about till the end of time, instead of talking about the things that actually affect all of our lives, our pocketbooks. Are we at war? Like things that
Right.
if we actually stayed in that space, not as exciting, but we would find a lot more commonality. But I'll say, and we'll get there in just a minute, but just I watched some of the hearings that we're going to talk about, and it was amazing to watch the interactions between you and Dan Burton, a Republican, Dennis Kucinich, and Waxman. It was a different tone. That I won't say it was perfect, and you were obviously complaining about some things that the other side had a perspective, but there was a conversation there. It feels, am I wrong? It feels so divided now. It's just, there's no common ground to be found.
Oh, it's hyper polarized, and I believe part of the reason it's hyper polarized is, the Republicans held, the Congress for 12 years. Then the Democrats took it back for 4 years. Then the Republicans took it back for a while. And then the Democrats took it back again. Nancy Pelosi was speaker twice. And so it's a battleground, basically, and it's a fight. And you don't get donations, and you don't get your volunteers excited by getting along. Basically,
Right.
You have to, and that's a lot of
again. We still feed on what turns the channel. The money comes for the conflict and the drama, and
it's a lot of what the hearings are about. The hearings are to some degree to really press the nominee to make sure they're ready for the job, but to some degree the hearings are political theater, and there are certain people who are going to say at the hearing something to excite their donors and excite their volunteers by being edgy or challenging. Churchill famously said, "Democracy is a terrible system. It's just the best system we've been able to come up with."
Right.
And I always say, no, there is a better system, and that's a good king. But good kings very rarely have good sons, and
Right.
really, the only good king is King Jesus. So,
Yeah.
and so we've got to just try to get along. But it's an adversarial system. It's, the word campaign has its origin in warfare. It does not have its origin in politics. Politics borrowed the word campaign from warfare, and it is warfare, and it's a civilization determined a long time ago, and I say civilization, Western civilization, that wars are bad, and so we'll settle political differences not with the sword or the bullet or the bayonet, but with ballots and words, and so it's the system that we have, and it's ugly to watch. A lot of people can't handle it. A lot of, particularly if they're registered, independent or no party affiliation, it's because
You try to be peaceful in the middle. It's a disaster.
yeah, they just don't. Now some people enjoy the repartee and the debates and the subjects that are being debated about, but a lot of people it's too stressful for them, so they'd rather tune out politics, and they often say a pox on both your houses, and but anyway, what is what is, as Coach Belichick used to say sometimes, the football coach.
So, I don't remember, nominees being withdrawn, I guess, is one of the things when I've looked at this. it seems like, sometimes you get through, sometimes you don't, but it's rare that a nominee isn't voted through. I mean, that's kind of a more rare event than it is. I mean, usually, and, oftentimes it's bipartisan, several different groups. But is this a new thing, or was I just not paying attention where President Trump has pulled I think are you the second one that got pulled prior to?
I was the first. There was a second one this week. Elise Stefanik, the congresswoman who was appointed.
I guess I was thinking about Matt Gaetz, though, but he never got that.
Well, I think Matt Gaetz withdrew himself.
Okay.
With the president's approval, but no, it's happened before.
Okay.
And it's a give and take. I think I probably, well, first of all, it should be said, the CDC director never had to be confirmed by the Senate until me.
Really?
The law was changed in 2023, and the two guys that were responsible for changing it were Rand Paul, the senator from Kentucky, and Tommy Tuberville from Alabama. They were both supporters of mine. They both supported me. But they, after the problems with COVID-19, they
wanted to say
they thought the CDC position was now so important after the pandemic that they wanted to have him confirmed or her confirmed. But if they hadn't changed that law, I'd be there at the CDC right now.
Wow. Does a president pull the nomination because they don't want a loss? Does that somehow affect credibility in some way? Like, why not give you the shot to go in front of these guys on television and see if you can win the day? Why do they take someone out of that opportunity?
Well, I'm not sure the president made the decision.
Okay.
He never called me. It was his staff. And what I was told is that there weren't enough votes to get me out of the committee. Now, it would have still gone to the floor of the Senate. And with Pete Hegseth, the vice president had to go and cast the tie-breaking vote.
Right.
So the decision, I guess, was made. I'm speculating now. I don't know this.
You're not in the
certain.
room. You get the call.
I just got the call, and that they didn't want to deal with all of this, and so they withdrew. There's probably more to the story that I don't know, but they could have let it go through. And who knows? I might have picked up a few Democrat votes, and I might have been approved by the committee.
It's got to be frustrating to not get the chance. Prepare
it's very
for a
frustrating.
Football game and you're not allowed on the field.
Yeah, well, particularly for me, I don't live in Washington, D.C., but I had to do all the, in the hotel, the suitcase, flying back and forth.
How long did you do that? How long were you?
I was up in Washington for the better part of 4 weeks.
So almost a month, yeah.
Yeah, almost a month. I was away from my practice. I still have a medical practice. I'm back in my medical practice now. And actually, most of my patients found other doctors, so my practice is kind of slow. So any of your listeners who need a doctor, give me a call.
All right.
And so it was very frustrating, actually. But, these kinds of things happen. And the hours for me would have been a lot longer, and the headaches would have been bigger. And so the encouragement for me is that having Bobby in there, I know the kind of research that I would like to do is going to get done, and we're going to get answers to a lot of these questions.
So then let's go to the reason, since you don't know why exactly, I think there is something we do know. We know what's the heart of the controversy around you. And it goes back 20, maybe even more than 20 years.
Yeah, actually, it goes back about 25 years.
Okay.
It all started, I was in Congress, and it all started with a phone call I got from a physician in my district who was a supporter of mine, who had a baby and a young son, and he calls me up and tells me that his son took an MMR shot and had a very adverse reaction to it with bowel problems and diarrhea and neurologic regression, and was later diagnosed as autistic. And he was of the opinion that it was caused by the vaccine. And I was really taken aback, with the call. It's a sad call to hear from anybody, but he was a friend. And the other thing that intrigued me is I had never seen a case of autism. I had gone through college, medical school, internship, residency, 6 years of service in the U.S. Army as an Army doctor, 5 years in private practice, and I'd never seen an autism case. And then he says to me that autism was increasing dramatically throughout the country, and it was his opinion that it could be related to the vaccines. And that shocked me as well, because I had been taught, of course, vaccines, were essential, and though some children can have a bad reaction to a vaccine, most children do fine with them and have very few side effects. So it was all kind of perplexing. And anyway, he invites me to go to a conference to say a few words. And the next thing I know, I have people coming to me from all over the country complaining to me about vaccine safety related issues. And the other complaint they had was that under the Vaccine Act of 1986, they had no recourse. And the other complaint they had,
They couldn't sue just for people that may be hearing this for the first time. In 1986, we passed the Vaccine Injury Compensation Act, which took liability away from the manufacturers and the doctors and the hospitals and anything to do with vaccines. If you are injured, you cannot sue anybody. You have to go through a government court system.
Right. And you face the Justice Department of the United States.
You literally have the Department of Justice using their
Justice
lawyers
Department lawyers fighting you if you want to get compensation. Yeah. And the other thing,
Did you know that at that moment? Did you know that there was liability protections?
Yes, I remember when the Vaccine Act was passed, and the way it was basically explained is the vaccine manufacturers were being sued so much that they were all getting out of the business. And I think there were only 2 in the business, and they were threatening to get out if they didn't get indemnification. And a lot of people, including myself, thought something needed to be done, because if all the manufacturers got out of the business, then we wouldn't be able to vaccinate our kids. And so the thinking at the time was that the Vaccine Act was the right thing to do. I think it went too far, personally. Yeah. But what was also interesting when all these parents from all over the country started coming to me is they said, nobody will help us. Nobody will talk to us. And, some said it was this vaccine. Some said it was this vaccine. Some said it was the mercury in the vaccine. And what really amazed me is some of the people coming to me were doctors. So these were physicians who were claiming that my kid was developing normal until they got that shot. And some of them were like college professors. So they weren't all lay people that, could maybe not understand science.
Some very well-educated people that understood the space.
I remember, in particular, a husband and wife, both ophthalmologists, both very, very bright. And they come to me and they insisted their kid was developing completely normal speech development, relational, and got the MMR shot, and boom, the kid went downhill within hours of getting that shot. And now I take care today of a 47-year-old who got a DPT shot and had
diphtheria, pertussis, and tetanus,
and had a bad encephalitis kind of reaction and ended up autistic. And he's like 47 now. And but a lot of these cases were being denied by the vaccine court and the act. And that was really the problem that bothered me.
And that's what parents are complaining about. Even in this system, we can't sue the manufacturers, and the system that the government's controlling, we're not getting our day in court. Stacked against them.
It's totally stacked against them. As a matter of fact, I'll never forget this. One of the people who wrote that bill, a congressman by the name of Henry Waxman, I once went to the floor of the House and complained about this very subject in what is called a special order. I gave a 5-minute special order on what I saw as the problems with the Vaccine Compensation Act. And he came up to me afterwards.
What year are we in? Just so people have, because we're saying 20, 25 years. We're talking about like early, like 2000.
I got elected in 1994. I was sworn in 95.
Okay.
And I left Congress in December of 08. So I was in there for 14 years.
All right, so you're talking to
Henry Waxman comes up to me afterwards. I'll never forget this. Now, I'm conservative Republican. He's liberal Democrat. And he comes up to me afterwards, and he was obviously moved by my speech and bothered by my speech. And he said to me, you know, I wanted the bill to be more liberal than it ended up, which I just thought was amazing, because I'm up there complaining that this needs to be made more liberal, and I'm a conservative.
Right.
And
he's the one that wrote it.
He's a liberal, and he realized it ended up being too conservative, and maybe families were being screwed. And he's lamenting to me. And I said, Henry, I'd love to work with you to try to fix it. But, you know, fixing something like that is, you know, that expression, it would take an act of Congress, is a real bona fide.
Right.
Having been there for 14
like finding
years,
a needle in the haystack. Well, it would take an act of Congress.
Well,
you take God striking
you got
with
the
lightning.
House, you got the Senate, you got all the committees, you got all the lobbyists.
Yeah.
You know, you try to change the Vaccine Compensation Act, you're going to have all of Pharma weighing in on it. It could take you 20 years, in my opinion, to amend the act.
To just address the act for people that haven't, I mean, I've done years of research and many, many interviews on it, but let's see if we can encapsulate it as quickly as possible, because it plays into this conversation in such an important way. But to be clear, one of the things that, you know, the anti-vaxxers, you know, will say at times that the pharmaceutical industry blackmailed Ronald Reagan and the government, saying you have to protect us from liability or we're going to stop making vaccines. Now, what we tend to leave out of the story is that there was parents like Barbara Loe Fisher and those that had injured children that were going to Waxman and to the government and saying, look, there is this, our children are this rare, you know, injured group that are having a bad reaction from this. If you're mandating this product and there's going to be this side effect, this casualty that you're accepting, you have to take care of them. It's costing us millions of dollars to raise these kids that are autistic. So they were in there saying, we are open to a liability protection as long as there's a system that says we recognize you've been injured and here's the money to take care of your kids. Is that, am I correct on that?
Yeah, you are correct. But there was another problem with what happened, in that it completely disincentivized the manufacturers to do research on safety.
Right.
And so if you're the CEO of a drug company and you've got a new product you want to bring out, you really are incentivized to make sure that that is safe before it gets released on the market.
Right.
Because number one, it could tank the stock value, and that hurts all of your stockholders, but as well you as the CEO, because most CEOs get paid with stock options, right? So I'm only getting paid, I'm the CEO of Merck, I'm only getting paid, you know, $2 million a year to be the CEO, but I've got $10 million of stock options. So you have a personal incentive to make sure that that new drug is safe. The problem with the Vaccine Act is that they have zero incentive to make sure that it's safe.
Cannot be sued. They will never be, their stock will never be hurt. They'll never be looked down upon.
And I've actually had lawyers argue to me that they are incentivized not to find out if there are safety problems with it, because if they can get the CDC to approve it and put it on the childhood vaccine schedule, half of all vaccines in America today are given away for free by the federal government through the CDC. It's about $10 billion a year.
Yeah.
And why would you want to discover that there's a 1 in 1,000 or 1 in 500 side effect from this? It could hurt your ability to sell it to the government. And you know, when you think about, you know, it's hundreds of of millions of vaccines, if you're only making $1 profit off of each vaccine, that's locked in profit for your company, right?
Yeah.
The government's going to come in and buy $10 billion worth of vaccines. And let's say it's 300 million vaccines, and you're going to make
Wow.
a dollar off of each one. Why would you want to carefully look to see if there's all kinds of rare, obscure side effects? And so
explain to the government as you're trying to sell it to them. Just so you know, there's a couple of these side effects that we discovered in the safety trial we did, but we think it's rare, and we think you'd immediately be in a bunch of conversations you don't want to have. Better just say, we never looked. But you don't say that. You just say, we haven't seen any side effects.
Well, that's what people have argued, and that's why people think the system is broken.
Yeah.
And now, you were asking me earlier, are you disappointed that you are not going to be able to be in there to try to fix this?
Yeah.
Yes, I'm very disappointed, but who knows? Maybe I can be more effective advocating from the outside than I would have been able to being on the inside. And so we will see, but thank the good Lord we have Bobby Kennedy in there, and we've got Jay Bhattacharya and we have Marty McCary, and maybe we'll get some good answers. One of the simple studies that I wanted to do was a prospective vaccinated versus unvaccinated study, because it's never been done. You would think it would be. There are all these thousands and thousands of Americans refusing these vaccines. 1 out of 10 families are refusing to vaccinate their kids for measles, and measles can occasionally cause very, very serious problems, including death. And 1 out of 10 are refusing. So why can't we just do a simple study and follow over a period of a year or two families that are taking the vaccine and families that aren't taking it, children who are taking it and children who aren't?
Yeah.
But that hasn't been done. And the value of that is it could be done as a prospective study where you're not going back looking through medical records. You could actually see and get a much better understanding. And you could look at all these vaccines for that matter. 90%, the CDC is currently recommending COVID vaccines for children. 90% of families are refusing to do that.
Yeah.
And so somebody has to wake up and really, take a good look at what CDC is doing. And
well, that's a disaster. I mean, that's a disaster for CDC, because that means people aren't taking you seriously anymore. And whether or not the argument that you're making right now is not whether or not COVID is a good vaccine. That's a whole other argument. The argument is that 90% of America does not believe they have to do what the CDC says anymore, that don't think that it actually benefits them, which is what happens. I mean, I always think it's like the boy that cried wolf problem. What happens if all of those people that don't trust the CDC, and suddenly the CDC is trying to get across to you that we have a serious issue and that you should be taking it seriously? If 90% have said, you've said that before.
Well, let me clarify there. Okay. 90% are refusing to do the COVID vaccine for their kids.
Yeah.
But
it's not much higher. Adults, I think adults are only about, 70% are refusing to get their latest booster.
If you actually survey the American people, whether they trust the CDC, the numbers are not quite that bad. I think it's 80% of Republicans don't trust the CDC. But 40% of Democrats don't trust the CDC, which is very interesting, because Democrats tend to be much more trusting and believing in the government and have greater faith in the government. But 40%, what I always point out when you start talking about these numbers, and I know a little bit about this because I'm a practicing physician, we get surveyed on patient satisfaction as doctors on a periodic basis. And if you're a doctor practicing medicine, if your patients, fewer than 94, 92% of your patients approve of you, you're considered a really bad doctor.
Really?
Most doctors have an
So you're
approval
like an
rate.
Uber driver. You better stay up there in the 5-star,
Right,
99
right,
percentile.
exactly.
Right.
Yeah, yeah. If you're not 5-star, and if you're a doctor practicing medicine and your approval rating from your patients is only 85%, you're considered a really bad doctor, okay? And that you have a problem. And 40% of Democrats don't trust the CDC, and 80% of Republicans don't trust the CDC. I assume independent voters, it's somewhere in between 60%.
Yeah.
So it's a real problem. And I think part of the problem is this vaccine stuff. Also a big part of the problem is the mishandling of the COVID-19 situation.
But that, I mean, I would argue, because I've been in this prior to COVID, that COVID was the first time everyone was paying attention. I mean, it had other issues, getting locked down, having your jobs destroyed, your schools shut down, but you did watch a recklessness from the CDC, I guess even NIH and Francis Collins trying to shut down. I mean, ironically, what a beautiful moment this week to watch Jay Bhattacharya, get confirmed, literally take the job of the guy that tried to shut him down, head of the Great Barrington Declaration. We have the email between Francis Collins and Fauci saying, shut them down, that they can't be heard by anybody. And to see that guy just took his job it's sweet.
It is sweet. You can thank Bobby, and you have to thank President Trump.
Absolutely.
And one of the things I like about both of them is, you can tell they want to do what is right. And,
I agree.
And it's not all, political calculus. They want to do what is best for the American people.
So let's go back to some other people that were really trying to do what was right. You're a part of a moment in history that a lot of people don't know about, where, there was a fairly significant group of representatives that were actually looking at this issue around vaccines. Of course, I'm talking about the Dan Burton hearings. How did you get involved in those hearings?
Well, as I started having people come to me, one of the things that was brought to my attention was the amount of mercury, toxic mercury-containing compound called thimerosal that had gotten into the vaccine schedule. And I led an effort to pressure CDC and FDA and Pharma to get that mercury out.
Just to be clear, mercury, I think some people have heard different ways, like the second most toxic substance on Earth, or certainly the most toxic non-radioactive substance.
Yeah,
or
arsenic
something.
might be the worst.
Okay.
It'd be like giving arsenic to little babies.
Okay.
The thing that's so appalling about what happened with the mercury is a baby's brain in the first 6 months of life literally doubles. And there's just a tremendous amount of nerve development. The reason little babies are clumsy is their nervous system is not developed. And so after the baby is born, there's just a tremendous amount of neurologic development, as well as muscle development and skeletal development. But it's primarily neurologic development. And that preservative, thimerosal, is a neurotoxin. It's a known neurotoxin. And if you did the calculations, they were pushing these babies into the toxic range, clearly pushing them into the toxic range. And FDA and CDC never did the calculations. Actually, there was a fellow quoted in the media who was one of the fathers of the vaccine program who admitted it. We never did the calculations. They had an FDA meeting at a hotel in Maryland where they were scrambling, trying to figure out what they were going to do. Similar meeting down in the Atlanta area with the CDC officials. And so I got on all that and I started pressuring the agencies to just get it all out. Don't put thimerosal in the vaccines that are going into infants. These are little teeny infants. Why do you want to put mercury in there? And that came to the attention of Dan Burton, and he came to me and asked me to go on his committee. Okay. And I was already on 2 different committees, and it was going to be a third committee for me. So that's how I ended up
It's
on it.
amazing. Just, and we'll get right there, is if you look at the history of mercury, it's Mad Hatter's disease. The mercury being used on hats starts making adults go crazy. Their brain goes crazy. We're injecting this into babies right as their brains are expanding. And you had science. I've watched some of these hearings again where you could literally watch like neural prune, like where like the nerves and everything in the brain are shortening upon contact with mercury vapors and things. And of course we could just get, but this is a super toxic substance.
Very toxic.
And what you're saying is, everyone had focused on the amount of mercury in one of the vaccines. No one thought about, wait, we're giving 4 or 5 or 6 of these at a time. Then there's the accumulation of up to 70 by the time you're 18. And you started saying, wait a minute, look at the accumulation of this product.
It was terrible, and they finally relented. It took them years. They took the mercury out.
Yeah.
And the autism rate did not go down.
Right.
And so I came away from that saying there's more to the autism epidemic than just the mercury. But, there was evidence that it may have caused other things other than autism, some sort of speech and language development issues in some of the kids. But what always bothered me was they never took the mercury out of the vaccines that we sent overseas to vaccinate poor children in developing countries.
Mm.
And I'll never forget, this was just a few months ago, I was at this event in Washington, D.C. It had nothing to do with vaccines. It was an event about Israel. And there were a lot of foreign government officials there, and I had a government official from Africa come up to me, and he knew who I was, and he knew the work I had done on getting mercury out of the vaccines, and he said, but they kept the mercury in the vaccine that came to my country, and I had to say to him, yes, they did, and that was to save money. The government, I complained to government officials, you need to get it out of our vaccines, and you need to get it out of the vaccines that are going, to these poor countries. And they complained that it was going to cost millions of dollars, and there was insufficient evidence that the cost
toxic substances doing damage to children being injected with it.
I hate to say it, we'll take it out for the white kids, but we won't take it out for the black kids in Africa. I mean, that's basically what they were saying, because it will cost us too much money. And I just thought that was horrible.
And just to be clear for people that may be watching, thimerosal is a preservative. Some people have called it an adjuvant. It's never been listed as being used as an adjuvant, but it's in multi-dose vials. You don't find it in a single dose vial, but if you're going back in and out with the needle, they say they need it in there to make sure that it doesn't get some sort of bacteria or something in it while you're going in and out of the vial, right?
Yes. If it's a multi-dose vial, the potential to introduce germs when you're putting a needle in and out of it is high. When you have a single dose vial, you don't need a preservative in there. And it's used in like some eye drops, you'll actually see thimerosal. But when you use eye drops with thimerosal in it, you weigh, 175, 200 pounds.
Yeah.
But we were talking about little teeny babies, and your brain is fully developed. A little bit of mercury probably is not going to do you that much harm. But when you're a little bit bitty teeny baby and your brain is rapidly growing and you're just learning how to talk, not good at all.
So Dan Burton, why did he get into this issue? Why did he start having these hearings?
I think he had an involved child in his family that started to get him interested in it. And he had a similar experience that I had. He had not, he was older than me. He was a good 10 years older than me. And like me, he had never seen autism and never heard much about autism. And suddenly he had, I think it was a nephew in the family was autistic. And
it might have been a grandson.
Might have been a grandson, yeah.
That's right.
And he was like, what's this about? And then as soon as you started peeling that onion, you discovered it's popping up all over the place. So why is all this autism popping up. And by the way, I should say this somewhere during the interview.
Say it now.
To all those people who say, oh, it's not the vaccines, it's not the vaccines are safe. First of all, that's not true. We have the Vaccine Compensation Act because,
it's hurting somebody.
Thousands of kids every year are damaged by these vaccines. It's just that it's safe for the vast majority and we need them, but they do have side effects. But all right, let's say there's no relationship with the vaccine schedule. Even though the vaccine schedule went up and the autism rate went up, let's just, for argument's sake, say it's not the vaccines, okay? Well, then what is it? Why do we have all this autism going up? I asked the CDC officials the very question, is this just an artifact? Is this a change in the diagnostic code? Are we just picking it up better? And they said to me, no. They said, it is really going up. And I said to CDC officials, why? And they had no explanation, absolutely no explanation. And that's really at the heart of the problem. If you're going to say to me, you're anti-vax, even though I give a lot of vaccines every year, and there's no relationship with autism rates, fine. So what is causing the increased incidence of autism? And I, like I said earlier in the interview, I never saw it. I had gone through pre-med, college, medical school, residency, Army time. I never saw a case. And now everybody knows somebody.
I think, nationally we're talking somewhere 1 in 34. There's New Jersey's higher than that, where we think that's just because they're doing better data collection.
Well, the other thing that got me interested in this is the Somalis. The Somalis, there was some sort of civil war going on in Somalia, and they had, for some reason, a bunch of them ended up in Minnesota, and they started vaccinating their kids. Well, they never vaccinated their kids back in Somalia.
Right.
And they started seeing autism, and they started saying, why are our kids getting autistic? I also heard from Saudis. The Saudis never vaccinated their kids and never had autism, and they started vaccinating their kids, and they started seeing autism. I asked the CDC to study the Amish because the word on the street was the Amish don't have autism. Why don't you just go in there and find out if that's true? I don't even know if that's true that the Amish don't have autism. We have this measles epidemic going on in Texas right now amongst the Mennonites.
Yeah.
Oh, they're refusing, vaccines. Well, what is the autism rate amongst the Mennonites?
Right. Forget about, let's just put the measles discussion aside for a second.
Put it all, just find out.
What is their autism rate? What is the Amish autism rate? And you're right, the Somali story is fascinating because they didn't even have a word for autism.
Right.
They didn't have a word. They did not have it in their country. They come here, they get vaccinated, they're all living in an area. And not only did they have autism, they had the highest rate in the world in that Minnesota group. It was the highest rates of autism we had ever seen. And my understanding is, they were even trying witch doctors and things what is going on with our kids? They're going crazy, but I don't know if that might be a wives' tale. But what is true is it was the highest rates in the world. And where I get suspicious is when we have an issue like autism, like you said, didn't exist as you're a kid, doesn't exist in medical school, but now we're seeing it starting to rise at numbers that should be very alarming. We are moving away from a 1 in 10,000 problem to, I'm assuming, right around the time of the Burton hearings, what were they saying then, 1 in 250, or where were we at right about then?
Yeah, it was about 1 in 250, but it very quickly started coming down. And, while I was still in Congress, it was 1 in 150.
Yeah, this is a rocket ship.
Yeah. And now that some of this data it's 1 in 40,
34, 1 in 30, no, it's 1 in 34 nationally, and some states are showing 1 in 28. And amongst boys, where it's more aggressive or a bigger problem, we're talking about 1 in 18 in boys. So this thing has
and our government
exploded.
Has no explanation for that.
Right,
and we spend how many billions of dollars on NIH and on CDC, and we have no explanation for this. I mean, to me, it's one of the greatest failures of our government, maybe only secondary to the management of COVID-19.
Yeah.
Why do we have no explanation for this?
Right.
And why can't we look at the rate amongst the Amish? The Orthodox Jews in upstate New York are refusing the vaccines. What is their incidence? The Mennonites in Texas, what is their incidence? I think it would be very useful information to know that it's lower or it's the same. Okay?
Right. Let's find out.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Let's go into, Pennsylvania and Ohio, the rural areas, and find out, what if the autism rate is exactly the same? Well, then maybe it's not.
Right.
Vaccine.
I mean, these are all things that, and this is where I think this thing really gets convoluted, that by asking the question, you're suddenly blackballed, right? This is just data, right? We should be able to go and say, hey, there are these large groups that by their religion don't vaccinate at all. Let's see what their rate of autism is. There's this group of Somalis that had never vaccinated before, all literally have the same culture, a lot of the same DNA, eat the same diet, and suddenly in America, they have the highest rates of autism in the world. Can we figure out, is there something in the water in Minnesota? Is it and it's not everyone in Minnesota, it's just this group of people. I mean, this is where I got very frustrated as a medical journalist doing an investigation. It seems to me, if my CDC, and as you're saying, the most funded science body in the world, really wants an answer to these questions, there should be the biggest CDC building ever built right in the middle of Minnesota, doing the greatest study that's ever been done of a people that have never had this disease and suddenly do. There's got to be something we can understand there. Instead, you can't even get the CDC to do a census. They won't even go and ask the question, what are the rates?
Well, this is why many people are highly suspicious of the CDC, and they're also highly suspicious of Pharma, of the vaccine manufacturers, that they are deliberately suppressing the truth. And I share that concern. I really do. The Pharma today in America is, in my opinion, if not the most powerful political force, it is definitely one of the most powerful political forces. Not only because they spend $440+ million a year lobbying, but they advertise on ABC, NBC, CNN, CBS, millions and millions of dollars, hundreds of millions.
It's between 50 to 70% of advertising.
I think it's billions.
Yeah,
and magazines. When I got nominated by Bobby, Forbes quickly did a hit piece on me. But if you pick up Forbes, it's full of Pharma advertising.
Right.
And so you have to say to yourself, well, maybe there's a relationship here.
Right.
And maybe, the CDC, one of the things I wanted to look at, one of the things I found fascinating right after my nomination, I asked to meet with Dr. Redfield, and Dr. Redfield disclosed something to me that blew my mind. He said the way you get promoted at the CDC is by publishing research articles, okay? And I was taken aback by that because I thought it was, an epidemic preparedness agency. I didn't think it was like a college or a university. And who funds their research? Well, a lot of their research is funded by tax dollars, but a lot of it is funded by something called the CDC Foundation. And the foundation gives money to the CDC to do research. Well, guess who gives money to the CDC Foundation? Pharma.
Yeah.
Pharma. And so do we have a situation where not only they're lobbying, not only are they controlling the media, but they're also controlling the employees at the CDC because they're indirectly through the foundation.
Funding interest studies that are going to promote the ones that do the studies the way they want us.
Right. So you're upset. I'm upset. They never studied the Somalis.
Yeah.
They never studied the Amish. Well, maybe they didn't study the Somalis and they didn't study the Amish because it would have been a career killer for them if they had actually done that.
Yeah.
And so.
Yeah, like what CDC official is going to do that when the funding to do that study is coming from a foundation funded by Pharma? Right. I mean, this revolving door is what Robert Kennedy Jr. ran on. And just before I get too far away from it, yeah, pharmaceutical is, as we see the numbers, outspending oil and gas 2-1 as far as a lobby. It is the biggest, as far as money given to politicians. But how does that work? I mean, and Senator Ron Johnson told me recently, we don't get that much money from pharma. It's not a game changer. It doesn't affect how we vote. He says it's more about how many times they come into my office and just, have lobbyists around. But what is your perspective of that?
Well, there's a fair amount of truth in that. Now, I don't know what his particular situation is.
Okay.
I know the House really well.
Okay.
And in the House of Representatives, what they do is they give a tremendous amount of money to the people on the two committees that control the health industries in America, and that's Ways and Means and the Commerce Committee, and particularly Commerce Health. So if you're on those two committees, you not only get money from the Pharmaceutical Industries Association, but then you get money from each member of the Pharmaceutical Association. So it adds up to a lot of money. It really does.
Sure.
Like if you're a typical, Commerce Health subcommittee member, you might get somewhere between $50,000 and $100,000 a year from the pharmaceutical industries for your reelection race. But then what a lot of these other people do is they also have a leadership PAC, and they get a second donation into their leadership PAC, and then they go after, the speaker, the majority leader, the minority leader, the majority whip, the minority whip, and right down the line, the caucus, the conference chairman, and so they have this sort of blanket effect where they've affected all of these people. I know this. When I did my advocacy to get the mercury out of the vaccines, I had 39 Democrats, 40 Republicans helping me. Nobody was taking pharmaceutical company money. The people who were taking pharmaceutical company money didn't want to touch the issue. And so what Senator Johnson said is to some degree correct, in that they don't control your mind, and he in particular is a strong independent thinker.
He is,
and I couldn't see him getting corrupted by money. But when you're sticking your neck out like I was openly expressing concerns about vaccine safety. I was openly expressing concerns about mercury in vaccines. You're putting a little target on your forehead, and if you're one of those members of the House or the Senate who aren't getting a lot of money from those industries, you're going to be more likely to help me out of the goodness of your heart. Whereas if you're getting a ton of money from them and you have aspirations to run for governor someday and raising money is a really important thing for you, you're going to think twice before you team up with someone like me who's really taking on CDC and Pharma on a very, very critical, important issue. And so I guess what I'm saying is I agree with the senator, but I disagree with him a little bit. His
experience may be, because he's not, I don't know if at the moment he said that to me as a year or two ago, if he wasn't in a health committee or he wasn't in that space where that would be a focus of attention by Pharma, that maybe he's not seeing the same types of funds. But going back to the hearings in this moment where we could be living in a different world today, I believe. What was the goal? Was the goal of the Burton hearings to just get mercury looked at and out of vaccines, or what was the sort of the stated intention of those hearings?
Well, the stated intention of those hearings initially was focused on the mercury issue.
Okay.
He was very concerned about the amount of mercury that was allowed to go in those vaccines, and you know, just for your viewers, what happened? It was in the DPT shot, which was 3 shots, okay, but it was given over a prolonged period of time, and then they added another vaccine with mercury in it called the Hib vaccine.
Mm-hmm.
And then they added the hepatitis B vaccine, which was pretty egregious about the hepatitis B vaccine, is the recommendation was to give the first shot in the nursery after the baby is born.
First day of life.
First day of life. So this baby is sitting in a nursery, bammo, you're injecting it with a toxic mercury-containing preservative. And ultimately...
Or, by the way, a sexually transmitted disease that is usually only a problem for people in promiscuous sexual relationships or sleeping with prostitutes.
IV drug abusers.
Or IV drug abusers. So why a day one old baby even needed this vaccine? Of all of them, that has always been the easiest one, I think, to put a target on.
Well, I couldn't agree with you more. I complained about that. The argument that is used or was used is there's this very, very rare event, and it's something like 1 in a million or 1 in 250,000, where the mother will have hepatitis B and she'll deliver the baby, and the baby will get contaminated with the hepatitis B from the mother, and the baby will come down with hepatitis B at 3 or 4 days of life, and they would frequently die of the hepatitis B. So the rationale is, we'll just give them the shots. If we can't give it in the birth canal, we'll give it as soon as they're in the bassinet, we'll give them the hepatitis B. But it is a sexually transmitted disease that most kids don't have. Now, you can very easily test the mother. Just test the mother.
But they do, don't. I mean, Rand Paul brought this up amazingly. I think one of the most important moments in these hearings was Senator Cassidy used the hepatitis B vaccine with Bobby, saying, "I saw someone die, or no, almost a child almost died from liver failure because of hepatitis B." And then Rand Paul jumped in and said, "But we test the mothers, but that are giving birth,
Yeah.
And so we know whether or not you're positive or not for hepatitis B. And so then why isn't the mandate just for mothers that have tested positive?" And even Cassidy said, "Well, I mean, you make a good point there," which I've said to the press. You just watched science happen there. You just watched a senator who's a doctor who has a perspective, even used this as his argumentative case of why you should vaccinate, and then has to, when presented with the facts and the science, change his position, which is, all right, you're right. If you're testing negative, that vaccine, you should be able to opt out of that. Well, unfortunately, no one can opt out of it right now, because that's part of what puts me here. I get calls, because I've looked into this issue, and I've sued the government a lot with our nonprofit. I get calls all the time of mothers that they're calling Child Protective Services because I don't want to give this hepatitis B vaccine to my day one old baby. I can't get out of the hospital, and I'm sending lawyers in to defend them and say, will you let them out of the hospital?
What they did with that decision to start giving the hepatitis B vaccine to babies is they hijacked our vaccine program, which used to be about protecting children from childhood diseases like measles and mumps and pertussis. And they hijacked it and made it about a public health issue and a public health problem, hepatitis B. Now, hepatitis B is a public health problem. Hepatitis B is second only to malaria in terms of infectious diseases that kill people around the world.
Wow.
And Dr. Cassidy got up on the floor of the Senate and said, "I have seen people die of vaccine-preventable diseases." And the reason he said that is he's seen people die of hepatocellular carcinoma, which can be a complication of hepatitis B. And if that person had been vaccinated as a baby, they wouldn't have gotten it. But most people don't get hepatitis B. It's a sexually transmitted disease, and it's a disease of IV drug abusers. You can give the vaccine at age 10, Why did they hijack the children at first day of life for this basically a social problem? And there was no discussion about this, by the way. There was no open debate amongst pediatricians and policymakers about taking the childhood vaccine schedule and making it about a public health issue, which is really not a big public health issue in the United States. Now, globally, it's a big issue.
Yeah. In your letter, you wrote a letter I joked was probably written in all caps in the first draft, as you had been uh, gotten just 12 hours notice that you weren't even going to get to have the hearing. You wrote about a 3-page letter laying out just your perspective of what had just happened. I love things like that, by the way, because they're so honest and real. We sort of see government as though so apart from ourselves that when we get these little glimpses of the human beings, that they're just human beings and they're going through this very strange experience. But in the letter, you brought up Dr. Andrew Wakefield, which I thought of a 3-page conversation to bring in that level of controversy. I would say around this topic of vaccines, there is no greater, more controversial figure in the world than Dr. Andrew Wakefield. I will give the caveat, he was the director of the film I produced, Vaxxed, that puts me in the middle of it. So I don't say that as like shocker, but take me back to how you met Dr. Andrew Wakefield, because it obviously had enough of effect that 20-something years later, in a 3-page, discussion about why you had just lost this position at the CDC, you chose to write about him.
Well, let me give you the background on that.
Yeah.
But before I give you the background on that, I have to say, I think he is probably one of the most unfairly vilified human beings alive today in the world. And, people have expressed sympathies to me for what happened to me, but I consider, what happened to him to be, significantly worse. So I mentioned earlier, I had this friend who was a doctor, and he said he thought his kid was made autistic by the MMR vaccine.
Mm-hmm.
And he invites me to speak at this event in Orlando. And my district came close to Orlando, so I had a lot of reasons to be in and out of Orlando, and I was going to be in the area that day. So I thought I would just get up and express, my condolences to, the families that were there who were making the same sort of claims that their child had been made autistic by a vaccine.
So specifically not just just very specifically in a conference about autism and vaccines.
Correct. This was a meeting of some scientists, some officials, and some activists, and then just some parents. And it was not in my district, but it was, bordering on my district. So I go, and Andrew Wakefield is there, and he's a British researcher. He's at a prestigious hospital in London, and he was presenting his data, and I thought it was very, intriguing, to say the least. And so that set up sort of a dialogue between me and him. I never chose a career in research, but I read, the medical journals. I've read the New England Journal, the JAMA, and the Annals of Internal Medicine my entire medical career. And my undergraduate degree was in biochemistry. And so I've always been interested in science and research. And I did a little bit of research in college and in medical school, but not a lot. But anyway, I got to know him, and I got to know his research, and then we basically kept in touch. And he published about 15 papers, and he defined a new form of childhood inflammatory bowel disease that heretofore had never been described. There were researchers in the United States who duplicated his research and showed that it was indeed true. And I remember talking to CDC officials at the time and saying, is this legit? Did Wakefield really discover that these, because, what the parents described of the kids that claimed their child was made ill and in some cases made autistic from the MMR, what they described is the kid had normal bowel movements and then started developing diarrhea. The kid was eating normally, and then the kid became a very fussy kid. And the kid had normal speech and language development and then stopped talking. And that was basically the syndrome. And his research, he published 15 papers, 14 of them were not withdrawn. Okay, the condition that he defined is an established known condition that these kids will develop this bowel condition. What got him in trouble is he gave some of his biopsy specimens to a virologist in Ireland by the name of O'Leary to do analysis on the biopsy specimens and to specifically look to see if there were measles particles in those biopsy specimens, vaccine strain measles. Now, what caught my attention immediately was I knew who O'Leary was, ironically, because one of the things I used to do before I got elected to Congress is I used to care for AIDS patients. And O'Leary had discovered AIDS patients can get this form of cancer. It's a form of skin cancer. It's called Kaposi sarcoma. And O'Leary determined that the people who developed that were people who got co-infected with a virus called herpes simplex type 8, okay? And it was published in the literature. So he was a very respected, renowned virologist.
Yeah.
And Wakefield ultimately brings O'Leary into my office and shows me his PCR data that showed that these kids with this inflammatory bowel condition actually had vaccine strain measles particles infecting the lining of their large intestines. And I was, blown away when I looked at this. And I actually looked at his photographs and it's a fluorescent type of photograph. And anyway, that was published in a journal called Lancet. Immediately, British parents started refusing the MMR. They started having some measles outbreaks. The health department in England pulled all the fire alarms, went into damage control mode. What they should have done, and it's still to this day has never been done, is try to repeat that study. And nobody has the nerve to repeat that study, which is one of the things that I wanted to do if I was at the CDC.
Right.
I would get those biopsy specimens and I would look to see, is that vaccine strain measles particle? And that's one of the first rules in research. If you discover something in biomedical research that is revolutionary, that is iconoclastic, you want somebody somewhere to try to repeat it. And I've seen many times they can't repeat it.
Right.
And so
in fact, that's been an argument about the medical journals. A lot of these studies have shown that 50% of these
not repeatable
are not repeatable. Like it actually isn't true.
Exactly. Right. But why didn't somebody
attempt
to do that?
Right.
What's that all about? Why did you even at least try?
Again, let's point out this is a disease that is starting to skyrocket in America, but also around the world. It is catastrophic to the people that or at least have serious cases of it. It is truly an epidemic. So you would think there would be a desire to see if this is true. Is this somehow related to the measles strain from the vaccine in the gut affecting these children's stomachs?
This is why I've engaged on this issue all these years, because it drives me crazy when I think about it. I don't make any money off of this. I'm an internist. I take care of old people, and when I was in politics, there was very little benefit for me to be engaging in this stuff. But when you ask those kinds of rhetorical questions, it's like, why can't you? So anyway, they get Lancet to withdraw the article, and they get O'Leary to withdraw his data and basically say, no, that's not what it showed. And so this is 20 years ago now. I get on the phone with O'Leary and I said to him, why are you doing this? You showed me your data. And there was this very pregnant pause. And then he says, it's taken me a long time to get where I am in the scientific community. And then there's another pregnant pause. And he says, I have 4 small children at home. And I said to myself, they were threatening this guy with ruination. They were going to kick him off faculty. They were going to make it impossible for him to get research grants. They were literally going to put him and his 4 kids and his wife in the poorhouse. And I was just completely flabbergasted. And then, back to Andy Wakefield, the other thing that, and why I talked about him in that letter, I thought the way he got treated was horrible. The way they treated O'Leary, the way they treated the editors at the Lancet was horrible. They were stifling scientific inquiry. They should have tried to repeat that study, and they didn't want to repeat it. The next thing they do is they go after Wakefield's medical license, and there were 2 other authors on that study, and they went after all 3 of them and tried to take their medical licenses away. And Andy had come to the United States, and he could not afford to defend himself in front of that inquiry, in front of that medical licensing board. And it's sort of like a court case, basically. But the other 2 guys had insurance because they were still on faculty at the hospital, and they were able to defend their license, and the government lost its case. And if you actually go back and look through those records, the records clearly show they never did anything unethical. They never did anything that was scientifically dubious, and that Andy Wakefield's license should have never been taken away. And so that is why I spoke about Andy Wakefield in that study. Even if Andy was wrong, even if it wasn't the MMR, you should have just repeated the study. Why did you pressure the Lancet to withdraw that article when they did nothing wrong according to the inquiry that was conducted? And why was O'Leary pressured like that?
Yeah.
I can only assume it was emanating from high government officials and the vaccine industry, because, and what's very tragic to me is if all of this turns out to be true, and essentially the theory we're discussing here is that, most kids, tolerate the MMR just fine, but there's a small subgroup of kids who become autistic, and the government is denying a relationship, and there really is a relationship, and those children and those families need to be compensated.
I've done thousands of interviews of these parents and their children. They describe a very similar event. Many times got the vaccine that night, sometimes 3 days of incredible screaming, crying. We assume now that's some sort of a brain swelling event, encephalitis that's causing the pain, the child's screaming. Then all of a sudden, after they come through that, they are now have diarrhea, but it's described as like a Clorox smelling, burns the skin on their bodies. Like it's a horrific condition, or incredible constipation where they can't go to the bathroom for weeks on end, but their whole digestive system is wrecked. And what Andy was looking at, he was a gastroenterologist. People don't really realize that. Like he had done work on Crohn's disease in the gut and had even shown that he believed a live measles infection could lead to Crohn's disease. And so there was this hypothesis, is the measles vaccine maybe doing a child version of this? And so that's the investigation that he ended up doing. What was so fascinating about it is this was supposed to be a neurological disorder, but the question was, is the gut issue coming from a neurological disorder? That doesn't make any sense. We have no history of understanding that. Or is it this gut condition, this bowel disease, affecting the brain in some way? And I remember with Andy, the thing that really was shocking to me is he said the day before we would do the colonoscopies, when we'd clear their gut system out, like any of us would do, you take the stuff that just makes sure that you're so clear the cameras can see what they're doing. He said the autism mannerisms would disappear. Like many of the things that they were doing that we call autism, for that day when they had nothing in their stomach, they would be different, which is...
Well, now we know there's a gut-brain relationship.
Right.
There's been a lot of research on this in the past 20 years. And yes, the mechanism may be primarily through the gut, adversely affecting the brain. I do know that if you look at, post-mortem brain studies on people with autism, that the brain is damaged. It's not normal white matter. The connections are not the same, and that can be induced by lots of different things, and it could actually be related to the primary disorder in their gastrointestinal tract. Who knows?
Who knows?
And the research on
But
this,
why don't we know?
because
right?
they haven't been spending
know.
they won't spend any money
Right.
on studying this.
Right.
You would think that they, what is the NIH budget? $60 billion a year. The CDC budget is $10 billion a year. You'd think they would just put a little bit more money into this subject to find out. There have even been articles in the New England Journal of Medicine where some of the major grandfathers of the national vaccine program have lamented that there's not enough money being spent on this research, and it's just not. But I was happy to bring up the case of Andy Wakefield because I think he was a fellow who was very, very unfairly treated.
Yeah.
But Pharma got what they wanted. They can say the article was withdrawn, even though 14 of his 15 articles were never withdrawn. They said his research was withdrawn, which is not exactly true. Most of his research has stood the test of time, and that his license was revoked. And that's all, of course, a lot of people in the media need to hear, and a lot of the public needs to hear.
Yeah.
And so I've always been troubled by the way he was treated.
Yeah.
And so when I wrote that letter after I was rejected by the Senate Health Committee and Senator Cassidy, I felt compelled to tell the whole story, at least as I saw it, when I was engaged on this issue of autism and vaccine safety.
Well, I mean, you're right. Every time the conversation comes up, that's that crazy British doctor that, fraudulently manipulated a study to show that the MMR vaccine causes autism. Nothing, and that is the statement you can ask a layperson that has any inkling on the conversation. That's exactly what you'll hear, and none of it's true. Number one, no fraud was ever proven. No fraud. He didn't lose his license over fraud. I just want to clear it up because you're right. It was over an ethical question. And that was it medical research that was being done? This is a study of 12 children. Was it medical research or a clinical investigation? And if it's medical research, which means you're doing biopsies and colonoscopies on these 12 children, if it's medical research, it means you're not doing it for their benefit. You're doing it to study something. And if you're just doing it to study something, you're kind of using these kids. So you need to get, an ethics approval to do that work. Right.
Yeah, and that to me is straining, the whole issue of ethics. Okay.
Right.
If you come in to see me and I do a biopsy on you, and it discovers something and I send it off for further research, to come back and say that was unethical what I did.
Right.
He didn't do anything that was unethical.
No, right.
I mean, it's just, but it was a stretch. It was a real stretch.
And the guys, especially Professor John Walker Smith, one of the other authors, eventually gets his license back, and the judge says this was totally mishandled. And the judge said that ultimately, and Professor John Walker Smith, by the way, was the one doing the biopsy, the one actually. Andy's just over his shoulder taking notes. So he's the researcher. There's an actual work. And what Professor John Walker Smith said is, I treated all these children for years beyond that study. I went on to continue. I wasn't doing medical research. I was doing a clinical investigation to see what was going on with he was a gastroenterologist too. What's going on with them and how do I heal them? And so he gets exonerated, but that was what they had decided. What they said was, you were doing medical research, therefore you didn't get ethical approval. And John Walker Smith says, I never needed ethical approval. These were my patients. And so why is Andy losing his license when he's just the guy staying in the room taking notes? So the whole thing is
it's bogus.
It's so bogus. And by the way, I did the investigation because in order to make Vaxxed, he was already working on it. I realized I'm about to attach myself to
Andy
Wakefield, which is going to be a career ender for me. But when I saw the same thing you did, I just thought, oh my God, this is the fraud is what happened to this guy.
Oh,
you know.
absolutely.
And I didn't know about O'Leary.
Yeah, O'Leary was
Yeah,
the virologist. He was sort of an innocent bystander,
yeah,
you could say, because Andy just sends him the biopsy specimens, and he does the PCR analysis and says, yeah, those appear to be vaccine strain viral particles infecting the
right.
guts of these kids.
But then, you see Cassidy, you watch Elizabeth Warren, you watch Bernie Sanders, like pounding the table on this is a mountain of evidence that shows that these vaccines don't cause autism. Admit it now that this mountain of evidence, this mountain of evidence, this mountain of evidence. And I would imagine like you, I'm like, I don't know, but I can't find any mountain you're talking about. What I do see is threatening doctors that did do studies, refusing to try and replicate those studies, going after licenses of anyone that dares to even try to do a study on this. Like you have bullying going on in a scientific community for no reason.
And intimidation. It's
Yes.
called intimidation. What they've done is they've produced epidemiologic studies that seem to show that there's no relationship, okay? And there have been multiple epidemiologic studies. The problem with that is epidemiologic studies are considered the weakest form of research on something like this. And what you really need to do is prospective clinical trials. And you can do a retrospective clinical trial, but you need to do a clinical trial, and you need to do vaxxed versus unvaxxed.
Right.
And they're just not wanting to do any of those studies. And why are they intimidating? Why are they bullying? Why are they refusing to do the proper kind of studies? It raises the suspicion of a cover-up, and it raises the suspicion that they're in bed with big pharma and nobody wants the truth to come out. Because if this does ever come out, there's going to be a hue and cry for a massive reform of the vaccine program, a hue and cry for a massive compensation to these children and these families who've been affected by this. It's going to undermine the credibility of the entire biomedical establishment. And so that's why they're engaging in this kind of activity. Hopefully, now that Trump is in and Bobby is in, we'll start to get some real answers to these questions.
That was what hit me and people try to say, well, what's the motive? Why wouldn't the CDC do these studies? Or why are doctors giving them, like you're saying doctors are poisoning children? I was like, no, first of all, doctors don't know anything about this. They don't know that there's scientists being bullied that have tried to look at this product. They don't know. I'm surprised how many doctors don't know there's liability protection. I'm surprised how many senators and congressmen I've met with. I think it's changing now, but when I started this 7 years ago, you'd say they're protected from liability. Like, what are you talking about? I was like, you don't know that? I mean, you are a representative of the government of the United States. You don't know that we cannot sue the manufacturer. That's crazy. Why wouldn't you be able to sue the manufacturer? I mean, it's amazing how little so many people know about this issue. But what I started thinking was, and you see how they went after Andrew Wakefield. And there's so many issues like that. I know we could go on for days on the amount of people who have been bullied and pressured. But what I started realizing, and it was actually, I had a meeting with Jason Chaffetz when he was head of, was it Commerce Committee or one of the
government reform?
Government reform. And he was very interested in the movie I Made Bags. And I remember talking to him, and he was super, wanted to get more information, but there was something about the way that he was talking about it, something about a concern around it. Like, if I look at this, what am I going to see? Tell me what I'm going to see. What is it I'm going to see if I go in and investigate this? And I was explaining, I have a hypothesis of what I think you're going to see based on what I've seen avoided, what I've seen in these interviews. And it occurred to me as I left that day that this isn't just, does a vaccine hurt some kids? I realized just what you said, and it's as explosive as you said. The question, and what I think Jason Chaffetz, because I could never get him. At first, he seemed really inspired to look into it, but each time I met with him, he got less and less inspired. And I was like, what is happening? And I realized that no congressman and no senator ever takes this job to destroy confidence in the government of the United States. You're here because you love this country.
Or the entire biomedical research establishment of Western civilization, right?
And that's what's at stake here. And people, it's that big that if we saw unequivocal evidence that there has been a cover-up and that when we do the science that this product that we were telling people was safe, that doesn't cause autism, actually, I mean, I know it's not the only thing that contributes to autism, but if this product actually does, after all of the language, all the Sanjay Guptas on the news, all of the, the Senator Cassidys and the Bernie Sanders screaming about how safe this product, there's no way that it causes autism. If it does, and it hit me, we won't get in the omnibus proceeding, but very early on by 2000, as soon as we took away liability protection, you had 5,000 cases lining up. Tens of thousands, probably more than that didn't even know they could be suing on this issue. They were paying out $3 million or more apiece for proving that the vaccine was causing autism. So the government suddenly finds itself in this position. We took on the liability. And if we're going to pay $3 million per child whose life is destroyed, and there's tens of thousands, if not hundreds of thousands out there, it's
trillions of dollars.
It's trillions.
Yes.
It's trillions. It wipes out anything the vaccine program has in it. It wipes out as you just pointed out, more than the budget of NIH, the budget of CDC. And I thought when I looked into Jason Chaffetz's eyes, and I've never talked about this, I probably shouldn't be using his name, but I think I'm being fairly general about this is my hypothesis. I thought, what would I do as a politician if I realized if I do this investigation, does it just blow up the CDC? Do I destroy the CDC? Because I definitely would. If this comes out, the CDC's done. Does it get bigger? When do the atoms stop splitting on? It's like the first time the nuclear bomb's going to be dropped. We know it's going to split a bunch of atoms. Does it ever stop? Does it stop at HHS? Does it wipe out all of HHS? Or does it kill the confidence of every American in our government? And does it wipe out the government of the United States of America?
Well, it could go beyond that. It's affecting British system. The British health officials were involved in destroying Andy Wakefield. The Japanese, the Germans. It reaches into the deepest internal workings of our modern global biomedical establishment. And it's very interesting to me that these major U.S. companies are entwined with all of these other countries and their biomedical research. And so it's breathtaking when you think about it. If it ever is determined to be true, fundamentally, that a substantial percentage of these kids actually were damaged by one of these vaccines, and that officials have been stifling it for decades, that it basically shakes the foundation of not only our U.S. government, but governments around the globe. It shakes the foundations of the, biomedical research establishment. You can't go into any major city in the United States and around the world where you don't have these institutes of science and learning. And if the grand leaders of all of these have their fingerprints on this kind of a cover-up, then it shakes confidence, basically. What can the public have confidence in if this is ultimately found to be true? Yeah. I don't know. I love my country. I devoted my life to science and medicine, and so, to me, the right thing to have done would have been just to study the Amish, study the Somalis, study the vaccines better, do prospective studies. You got all these people refusing the vaccines. I had one of my patients say to me yesterday in the office with a smile on his face, I have an 18-year-old son. He's never been vaccinated for anything, is what the guy says to me. Because everybody's talking to me. They know I've been rejected for CDC Director. Well, not all of them. Some of my patients are kind of, they're oblivious to those sort of things, but most of them know. And this one guy said that to me. He's with a smile on his face. And
does that make you feel good though, or does that make you nervous?
Well, honestly, I have to say it makes me nervous. I think there were 5 million cases of measles globally last year, mostly in poor countries,
Yeah.
and they attributed 100,000 deaths to that. I had a very interesting conversation with Andy Wakefield, very early on in all of this, and I said to him, and he agreed with me. Well, we got to vaccinate our kids for measles. We can't. Just now we can improve the measles vaccine a lot, I believe. And we've improved other vaccines, used to be the DPT,
Yeah.
and now it's DTAP, acellular pertussis, because there were problems. But he and I both agreed, you still have to do it. Now, one of his solutions was just give it later in life. Don't give it at 12 to 14 months. Give it at 16 to 18 months or something like that. But you still have to give it. But you are absolutely right. If this were ever to be proven to be true, it would be, I think it would be revolutionary. There's a researcher from Australia. I'm always fond of talking about this guy. His name is Barry Marshall. And he, like 25 years ago, started claiming that ulcers were an infectious disease, peptic ulcers, stomach ulcers.
Yeah.
And he was ridiculed. He was a gastroenterologist, ridiculed for decades. And ultimately, he was found to be accurate. And most people with peptic ulcers, I think a majority of people with ulcers, it's infectious disease. It's caused by a particular type of spirochete bacteria.
Mm-hmm.
And you got to treat it with antibiotics. We were just treating it with like Maalox and Tums
Right.
but if you actually, and I think he went on to win the Nobel Prize, but for decades, the guy was ridiculed. He was absolutely ridiculed. And so who knows? Hopefully we're now going to find out, now that we have Trump in as president, Bobby as secretary of HHS. I don't know who they're going to, I understand they may make the acting permanent and they may get the right kind of research done.
Yeah.
But it could be, if it's proven to be true, that some of these autism cases are being caused by the MMR, and we need to make changes to the MMR, either improve it, separate it into 3 different vaccines, whatever the solution is. You're going to have a solution, essentially. You can't just stop vaccinating. There's going to be a lot of concern about confidence in our biomedical research establishment. How is it really about the truth, which is really fundamentally what you're getting at? What is truth, or is it about, groupthink? Is it about not making a bad career move? Is that what's guiding our biomedical research establishment? Clearly, we need some answers, and we need some answers fast, because if it's not the vaccines, then what is causing all this autism?
Well, we're going to wait till we're at 1 in 10, 1 in 6. We can't mount a standing army. I mean, we're getting to that point. 77% of kids cannot qualify to be in the military now. That means you can't defend your nation. That is a
It's appalling.
It's a security issue of major. What makes you back to the, as I said, I don't know if that was Jason Chaffetz's thinking, but I'm a writer. That's where I start, is I put myself in the shoes of the person I'm dealing with. And I thought, would I make that choice? Would I say, I am going to push a button that could literally nuke this government and the confidence of governments all around the world? That is what I do believe is at stake here. How are you wired? And is it okay to be wired? I mean, presented with what we just said, how many senators and congressmen would say, I think we just let those that are being injured be injured, because the devastating effects of losing the confidence of the world and this nation would be far more catastrophic. So are you reckless because you'd be willing to even get the answer to this?
No, I think it's reckless not to pursue the truth in this. And what, I think of when you say this to me is, if you come in the office to see me and I think you might have a cancer, if I say to you, oh, you're probably okay, and I send you on your way and I don't order the tests, then that's a tremendous disservice to you because you may die of the cancer that I could have diagnosed. So I will pursue this even if I know it's not going to make you happy because I think it's the best thing for you in the end. Now, I think it's the best thing for our medical establishment, for our nation, for our children, if this is indeed true that a lot of these kids are being made autistic, even though it's going to cost the government $1 trillion, even though it's going to shake the foundations of our biomedical establishment, even though it's going to be a devastating blow to pharma. And by the way, I use pharmaceutical products all day long.
I've had surgeries. Thank God for pharma.
Yes,
I mean, I've had moments I needed them.
Right, right. So in the end, we'll be better off is the bottom line. Now, I think personally that you could improve these vaccines dramatically. Indeed, who knows? 100 years from now, they may look back and look at a lot of the vaccines that we were giving in the 20th and early 21st century as being primitive. And it's like taking your gallbladder out. We used to slash people's abdomens open to take their gallbladder out. Now we use these little scopes to take their gallbladder out. When we used to cut their belly open, I would tell you it's going to be 6 weeks before you're back to your old self. But now using the scope and these little puncture wounds, it's 3 or 4 days and you'll be back to yourself. It's amazing.
But you would never have had that advancement in technology if there was no liability. Right? If with a product like why we have arrested the development of the vaccine program by taking any incentive to keep evolving this product and make it safer. Why would you? It doesn't cost me anything. It costs me more to do R&D on new products. So let's just leave it be. I mean, we probably could have a much more advanced product at this point. We should have prior testing. We should be able to understand if there's some genetic markers that maybe show a susceptibility, that maybe you take a product a different way. We make a different product for you. We separate the products differently for you. We change the age group for these specific individuals. I mean, so many things have been done. And by the way, it's not just autism. We have 60% of this country now has a chronic illness, up from 12% in the 1980s before we gave liability protection. That's the greatest rise and that was the greatest drop in public health ever recorded in that short a period of time. Something is doing it, is what I'm saying. Something is making us permanently sick. Children are leaving school on a drug. 1 out of 4 children are leaving elementary school on a drug they're going to be on the rest of their lives. That's not the health rate you had as kids. It's not where I was at. We know this.
ADHD.
Right.
ADD.
Asthma. One asthma inhaler in my entire school as a kid. Now 1 in 12 kids is walking around with an asthma inhaler.
Why is all of this going on? Are the vaccines playing a role? Is it nutrition? There are a lot of other issues that related to the vaccines.
All of which Robert Kennedy Jr. is going to look at.
One of the big issues is the adjuvants. There are a lot of people who have concerns about these adjuvants, that they're triggering changes in the immune system. I was listening to a fascinating lecture just last night about changing the way we do vaccines, because the way you get rid of these viruses is actually through something called killer T cells, and that we should be able to develop better vaccines that actually enable us to clear the vaccine more quickly than relying on antibodies.
Yeah.
And so there's a lot of, things,
advancement possible.
Yeah. There's a lot of things we don't know. I'll tell you something about adjuvants that's really interesting as it relates to mercury. Mercury was in there as a preservative in the multi-dose vials. And so I and others got Pharma and CDC to go over to the single-dose vial with no mercury in it. And they discovered it was not triggering a sufficient antibody response, and that they had to add more antigen to the vial, or they had to add an adjuvant to the vial, and that the mercury itself was acting as an adjuvant. which is fascinating when you
Which
think
for
about
people that just are maybe getting into this for the first time, an adjuvant incites the inflammatory event, like it incites the immune system. And then by inciting that immune system, then it sees that it's been injected with some viral particle or a bacteria particle and decides to create an immune response. Without that adjuvant, that particle could just float in and maybe never be discovered or detected or have a reaction. It causes a reaction.
Right. If you give the traditional approach to vaccinology is to measure antibodies.
Yeah.
Now, there are people, as I said earlier, who are trying to look at a totally different way to do it through cell-mediated immunity. But if you give 100 kids a vaccine and a certain amount of that vaccine, you then measure antibodies in the kids, and you want the antibody levels to be sufficient such that 95% of the kids are going to be immune, basically. And they throw in aluminum and other things to stimulate the immune response because it raises the antibody levels. And there are a lot of people who have concerns, legitimate concerns, science-based concerns, that the adjuvants themselves are causing some of these problems that these kids are having, particularly in some of these conditions like asthma. Are the adjuvants playing a role in causing altered immunity in these kids? And there's very little research being done on this, by the way, because there's no incentive to do the research.
There's no mountain of research being done.
There's no incentive to do, because the government pays and you can sweep all the problems under the rug. So fundamental changes need to be made. And I'm very excited to see what's going to come out of this administration.
Let's then sort of finish up. There's so much. I want people to go back and watch the Burton hearings. There's like 7 or 8 of them through that year, right around 2002. Incredible. Basically gets shut down. You don't get the research done that you would work towards. So many parents had so much hope that suddenly were being listened to. And then somehow just Pharma got a hold of, it seems, enough.
Yeah, I think it was leadership shut it down.
Leadership shut it down?
I believe so, yeah. And a lot of it was Pharma.
Yeah.
Pharma is, just incredibly powerful and very influential. I don't know how else to say it. You can rest assured officials from Pharma are going to watch this podcast.
Yes. Yeah.
And they're going to be concerned about a lot of the things that you and I are saying today. And they're going to be preparing,
the hit pieces are coming.
Yeah.
You're crazy. I have no medical background, which I'll just state it right now. I don't. What business does he have? What does he know? But I am a journalist. And as a journalist, and I would say I've been a journalist since I was 3 years old, and I was that annoying kid at the adults' dinner table. I never stopped asking everyone questions. I have been fascinated by humanity my whole life, and this is what I'm fascinated by. I think Senator Cassidy, that's my opinion, is the one that you were not you weren't going to get his vote, and that meant you were pretty much screwed. And it wasn't just there. We saw it with Bobby barely got past him. He had to make some backroom last minute deals that didn't look so good when Cassidy wrote about what they were. But I believe Cassidy's a good person. You know him. I think prior to this moment, you probably considered him a friend. He means well.
I did. I met him first time about 10 years ago. I met him at 2 different events. One of them was an all-day Christian couples retreat. I was with him and his wife, and my wife, and a bunch of other congressmen and former congressmen. We had dinner together. We talked medicine a lot. And I thought he was going to be my friend. It turned out he was my principal adversary for confirmation. And I was surprised. And that's the way politics is. Harry Truman said, if you move to Washington and you want a friend, get a dog, because, the person who's helping you today on this issue might be trying to torpedo you tomorrow on another issue. And, but you got to stand up for the truth, and you got to stand up for what you think is right. I think one of the assets I always brought to the political arena is it was never a career for me. People used to ask me, do you prefer congressman or doctor? And I always said doctor, because I considered congressman just something I would do temporarily, and I was really, in my heart, a physician. I wanted to be a physician from age 5. I enjoy my practice. I'm back in my practice now. I'm enjoying being back in my practice now. And in some ways, glad I don't have all the headaches of running the CDC. Running the CDC, there's a lot of other headaches besides the vaccine stuff. It's not just the vaccine stuff, though that's what we've been focused on.
Yeah.
It's a big agency. It's involved with a lot of other things in terms of pandemic preparedness and investigating, new infections on the horizon. And so I'm optimistic that Bobby Kennedy will get some answers to these questions. I really am.
What motivates Senator Cassidy? I mean, you share some things. You're both doctors. You're both being forced. You were forced to look at this from parents. I know Cassidy has parents that have come into his office. I'm sure of it now. I'm sure he's been, and yet he stands there emphatically demanding. And so did Bernie Sanders. But they're not Bernie Sanders, Elizabeth. They're not doctors. Okay. The question I think amongst the parents of injured children. By the way, you're not getting that position is so devastating to the tens of thousands, if not hundreds of thousands of parents of autistic children that really saw you as that beacon of light. One of the only people over decades, you, Bobby Kennedy, but one that could actually do something about it. Not seeing you go through is a devastating moment in this nation for those people that have been holding their breath, dreaming that someday someone that was willing to ask the question would finally be in touch with the science. But all that aside, does Cassidy, when he says there is a mountain of evidence that shows that vaccines don't cause autism, say it right now, Bobby, say it right now that you will, recant any statements you've ever made. And Bobby ends up saying, look, I'll look at the science. You don't have to look at this. What are you saying? You haven't looked at it, Bernie Sanders? You haven't looked at it? This is all you talk about. Have you not looked at it? And it goes on and on and on. Why are they so afraid that Bobby or you would actually do the science? Like, even if it's been done, let's say they're right. Let's say there already is a mountain, but everyone is losing confidence in this program. This story isn't going away. Why does Cassidy not see that if you're so correct, and Dave Weldon, Dr.
What
Dave
do
Weldon,
they have
or
to
Bobby
fear?
does it, right? What is he afraid of?
Yeah, if he's so confident,
Right.
Go ahead and let Weldon do some more research. If it's done correctly, then it will show the vaccines indeed are safe. Yeah, I don't know. Some people say he's not running for re-election. Some
But does
people
he know that there is going to be a problem? And this is what always confuses me. If you are censoring doctors, if you're bullying people, if you will not let a study get done, does that mean that Cassidy, is it subconscious, consciously? I know he's not the only doctor you've ever dealt with on this issue. Is there something inside of them that really must feel maybe there is an issue and I can't ever face that?
I can't answer that question. I met him at 2 different social events years ago, and I met with him in December shortly after my nomination, and then I met with him again about 3 weeks ago. I don't know what makes him tick. I know he's going to have a tough re-election if he does decide to run. If he doesn't decide to run, he's going to need a job. And I don't know if he's going to want to go back to being a gastroenterologist. So I don't know, why he's playing his cards the way he is playing them. I certainly wouldn't have. I would have just let Weldon through and let's, do some of this research. I have a bachelor's degree in biochemistry. I don't want to do bad research. I don't want to be the head of the CDC publishing bad reports that are going to be criticized. I mean, I would want to bring, the pediatricians in. I would want to bring the scientists in. And one of the simplest ones, we've mentioned it several times. Let's just go into the Amish and see what is the autism. I've brought that subject up with scientists, and they start saying the stupidest things like, oh, that's a homogeneous genetic group of people. We couldn't get valuable data out of that, and blah 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 blah. And I'm sitting there saying, why is this guy saying this to me?
Right.
Wouldn't you want to know if the autism rate is the same? Wouldn't you want to know if it's zero? Aren't those valuable data points? It's the same or it's zero? To me, now if it's somewhere in between, yeah, you could say genetics and blah blah blah, and you don't get the valuable info. But why?
What harm would it do?
What harm would it do?
Just do the study. Like if it's the same, then okay, then we've closed that door. We don't have to think about that any longer.
And what does it cost? I heard Cassidy complaining about all the money that we've spent on this subject. We haven't spent hardly any money on this subject as far as I'm concerned.
No, we haven't actually spent a red cent on vaccines and autism since 2004, since the...
But he says, we've spent all this money. We've spent money on these, in my opinion, epidemiologic studies, some of which are designed to cover it up, basically. And what harm could be done, and how much would it cost? $500,000, $1 million to go into Pennsylvania and survey, knock on doors.
Didn't we just save that by not doing transgender studies in Iran or something like that? Can we just put that money towards?
I mean, or developing a vaccine from monkeypox, for example.
Right.
CDC was eager to go off and do that. How many people are going to get monkeypox?
Right.
You know, it's just. It's just crazy. So I don't understand what motivates people like Senator Cassidy. Maybe we'll find out in time.
And we'll find out if he goes off and gets a really cushy $1 million a year position at Pfizer or Merck or something like that. We can ask, what are those promises being made at the moment that Robert Kennedy Jr. and Dave Weldon were trying to do the studies that had never been done? Time will give us that information. My last sort of question for you is one person like Robert Kennedy enough? Can he get these studies done in this bureaucracy that's there it does look like he has Trump on his side. Like, one of the things I push back, I've seen these two guys together. They have a really beautiful relationship. I see a mutual respect. Donald Trump has never held back that he wants this investigated. He wants to look at vaccines. He screams about autism. He's talked about the rise. So I know the pressure from the president is there. I know Robert Kennedy Jr. wants to be there. I don't know if this new choice will get it there, but you've watched this system. Can one passionate man like Robert Kennedy Jr. Have enough power to get these studies done?
Well, actually, that's a question I've asked myself quite a bit. And part of the reason I wanted to go to CDC is I wanted to be there to help him. And can he get it done? I think so. Will he be able to get it done? He's got, all of HHS, and the bulk of the money is for the Medicare plan, and the Medicare plan is in deep trouble. I mean, the spending is through the roof, and how do we continue to pay for all the health care for the seniors on Medicare is a great challenge. There's a tremendous amount of fraud going on. Bobby recently released his reorganizational plan. I liked it. I read it over. If I were him, I would try to get some really, really good people around me. Fortunately, the Secretary of HHS also has a 24/7 security detail, and I'm very, very thankful for that.
Yeah.
And I don't know what else to say other than, I'm going to say my prayers. My hope would be that maybe autism is caused by something else, and there hasn't been a massive cover-up. And Senator Cassidy is not corrupted by an offer for a lobbying job, and that we find the explanation for it. My hope is if you go and study the Amish, maybe the autism rate is the same, and maybe you can say, well, it's maybe not that we have to vaccinate our kids. Now, I don't think we have to give them as many vaccines as we're giving them. I think the number of vaccines can be reduced significantly. I think the vaccines that we do give should be improved. We've improved vaccines in the past. But Bobby is not in this, I know, for any other motive other than to do what is right for America. And it's a broad range of issues that he has to deal with. Chronic diseases, you've mentioned it. Our food system is contaminated. Too many preservatives, too many additives, too many pesticides. So he has a lot of things on his agenda. I think he's the right man for the moment that we're in now.
If he called on you to be in an advisory position or something right now, would you
I'd
take
have
that
to
call?
look at that. I would have to look at that because, as I said, he needs good people around him. And if he thinks I'm the right person, I would definitely look at it for sure. As long as it doesn't require Senate confirmation and I don't have to go in front of Dr. Cassidy again, I'm glad to help.
I want to thank you for your courage, because you're one of the few with courage in this space. The courage to face something that could be momentarily catastrophic to our systems of government and how we've been communicated with. I think we would overcome it. I think it would make us a greater nation, but it takes someone special, willing to face that. And I know that that was what was on the table. So it's unique.
Well, thank you for sharing that. One of my motives to try to get answers for these questions is they could have and they should have been answered 20 years ago. And if it ultimately is determined to be true that, for example, the MMR is causing autism in a lot of these kids, it breaks my heart to think about all the children that were made autistic over the last 20 years that could have been prevented and the lives that were disrupted and destroyed. And so my hope is that we'll get some good, solid answers, good, solid science, and we'll make things better.
My hope too. Thank you, David.
Thanks, Del.